During the Great Depression, kidnappings became so rampant that they struck fear into the hearts of every family. So, what caused this shocking epidemic, and how did it finally come to an end? Heading into the 1920s, many people believed that banning alcohol would make America a more peaceful place. So, on January 17, 1920, 46 states officially ratified the 18th Amendment, which banned the sale and consumption of alcohol in the United States. However, this ban that was intended to eradicate domestic violence, workplace injuries, and other social ills associated with drunkenness had the unintended consequence of creating a vast new liquor supply business that ushered in the dawn of organized crime that would dominate that decade and the next. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. Now, this period of time when alcohol was illegal in America became known as the Prohibition. And initially, within the first year of the 18th Amendment being ratified, Americans' alcohol consumption did drop to historic lows. But this was only temporary, and Americans continued to drink. First, you had the loopholes within the amendment, which were that you could ferment grapes at home and you were allowed to fill prescriptions from doctors that included alcohol. And then, of course, there were the religious exemptions, which a lot of Americans found God during this time. But the biggest issue came with the fact that getting rid of the corporate production and distribution of alcohol paved the way for a very large-scale, very profitable black market. Small street gangs were some of the first to take advantage of this new market, and with the amount of money coming in, they quickly evolved into very large criminal enterprises. They employed all different kinds of people, from accountants to warehouse workers and truck drivers. They bribed politicians, cops, and even the Prohibition agents themselves. Some of the groups imported rum illegally, which is where we get the term rum runners, or they distilled the alcohol in private homes, while others bought old breweries and just picked up where the previous company had left off. Now, all of this was operating in secret, though it honestly doesn't seem all that secret to me. But while the production and distribution of their business was done in the shadows, the violent part was all out in the open. Initially, the groups were kind of working together, but it wasn't long before gangs were openly fighting for territory in the middle of city streets. According to the FBI, by the mid-1920s, there were an estimated 13,000 gangs in Chicago alone. After some extremely bloody conflicts, these gangs started to realize that they could achieve more if they would just come to some sort of agreement as to who controlled which area. This led to treaties being made that allowed gangs to operate peacefully within their own territories. Many Americans were against Prohibition because they wanted to drink, and so they were happy with the service that these gangs were providing. And they started to see these guys almost like heroes. Of course, you also had Hollywood at that time portraying these guys as champions of individualism and self-made men who were surviving in tough economic times. And many attribute this with helping to foster and even glamorize a general spirit of lawlessness. The bootleggers and rum runners made being bad look cool. Prohibition ended with the ratification of the 21st Amendment in 1933, but the organized crime was there to stay. The crime families had already diversified into the worlds of illegal gambling, loan sharking, and prostitution, as well as other business opportunities. The money they had made during the Prohibition provided the fuel for this massive machine that continued to grow larger. Now, just to give you guys a little bit of perspective on the kind of money that we're talking about here, there was a point where some of the big bosses in certain areas like New York and Chicago decided to kind of consolidate some of the smaller gang groups into larger groups. And the guy who controlled Chicago, his protege was the infamous Al Capone. And when this guy retired, he left his empire to Capone, who inherited a business that's value was equivalent to $1 billion in today's money. And of course, as we all know, that amount of money brings with it a lot of power. As the glitz and glam of the 1920s ended with the Wall Street crash of 1929, the 1930s brought crushing poverty to the majority of Americans. And this depression led to huge increases in crime as thieves picked the country clean. Criminals roamed the streets, hijacking trucks, robbing banks, and even kidnapping for ransom. In fact, there were so many kidnappings or abductions in Depression-era America that some public officials began to speculate if they were witnessing an epidemic, which in fact they were. There were so many reports of kidnappings that the newspaper had a hard time keeping up with all of them. It was so bad that they almost couldn't even print them all. And the less sensational cases had to be printed in small type, like how they would list baseball trades or real estate transactions. So my book recommendation for this topic is one that unfortunately I ran out of time and I didn't get to finish reading all of it and preparing for this episode, but it's a book by David Stout called The Kidnap Years, The Astonishing True History of the Forgotten Kidnapping Epidemic That Shook Depression-era America. He references one particular issue of the New York Times that was printed on July 25th, 1933, where the front page news was about the arrest of several gangsters who had been arrested for kidnapping a beer mogul and then releasing him once a ransom was paid. This article also alluded to an attempted kidnapping on Long Island. Then there was another article in this same paper about the kidnappings of an Oklahoma oil tycoon and the son of a politician in Albany, New York. There was a report about a Philadelphia real estate broker who was shot dead in a kidnapping attempt. And then there was just this long list of other recent cases in which victims were rescued and the suspects had been apprehended. This list included 18 additional victims. In some of the cases, more than one family member was abducted at a time. So that was more than 20 kidnappings that were reported in one single day's newspaper. All across America, in both small and large cities, people were being taken, and typically these kidnappings were followed by a demand for money. Depending on how wealthy the family was, determined how much the kidnappers would ask for. In some cases, this number was negotiated down when it became evident that the family was not as wealthy as the kidnapper had assumed, while in other cases, such as in the Lindenburg case, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the amount was charged to a higher amount once the kidnapper or kidnappers realized that the family's wealth and influence had been underestimated. Some families paid the ransom and got their family member back within a few hours or a few days, while others paid only to find out that their loved one's life had already been taken. Now, these dramatic increases in kidnappings have been blamed on the Prohibition and then, of course, the end of Prohibition, which left bootleggers and rum runners out of work. And we do know that financial desperation is part of what led to an uptick in violent crime. During this era, kidnapping wealthy families became an easy way to make money. By 1931, it's estimated that more than 3,000 kidnappings had occurred in the United States. Of course, a lack of reliable statistics makes it impossible to confirm its exact numbers, but we do know that the uptick in crime and abductions was significant, and the dramatic increase in kidnapping specifically has been directly tied to organized crime and an overall general sense of lawlessness that resulted from despair related to the tough economic times and even corruption of law enforcement. Now, while the end of Prohibition did take away from the very lucrative bootlegging side of their business, as I mentioned earlier, the crime families had already diversified and they were making plenty of money from their other illegal activities. So my personal opinion is that ultimately the financial crisis in America was likely the root cause behind the uptick in abductions, especially when you consider that there were quite a few abductions that were carried out by random citizens who were not associated with any crime family. Between 1929 and 1933, unemployment in the United States jumped from 3.2% to 24.9%. Almost 1/4 of the official labor force was unemployed. In the 1930s, the average man was lucky to have a job at all, and the least fortunate were standing in bread lines while housewives were making soup from boiling bones and serving ketchup sandwiches for dinner. This was a time when the chasm between rich and poor was extremely wide, and people born into wealth were often hated by those who were at the bottom rung of society looking up. To paraphrase the author of The Kidnap Years, trying to look back and understand the past is like looking down at trees from an airplane. We often miss the trees for the forest. It can be hard for us to look back with our modern sensibilities and fully understand the extreme levels of fear and despair that people were experiencing at that time. Of course, this in no way justifies the heinous crimes that were being committed, but I feel like it helps to kind of frame just how bad things were for the average person back then. Many people lost their entire life savings when the banks went under. And for those people, they saw the bank robbers of that time as being like these Robin Hood type characters rather than criminals. Even those who had jobs had their hours cut, and many worked for months without ever seeing a paycheck. And when you look back at the news in those days, you find so many heartbreaking stories, like the street sweeper who was explaining to police why he had fed his starving family meat from a dead pig that he had found in an alley behind a restaurant. He explained how he had sampled the meat. It didn't seem to harm him, and so he gave it to his wife and his 10 children who also ate it. Soon, 2 of the children died from food poisoning. Within 2 days, more of the children had died. And at the time that the street sweeper was telling his story, he, his wife, and his remaining children were all gravely ill. Unfortunately, there were no updates letting us know if the rest of this family had survived or also passed away. It seems as though the journalists either didn't follow up or lost track of the family. But sadly, there were plenty of other stories to follow up on that were just as tragic. There were stories of men who ended their own lives after discovering their entire life savings had been lost, or in their despair, simply hopping on a freight train to nowhere, leaving their families behind to fend for themselves. Of course, money wasn't the only motive. Some of the kidnappers were just crazed killers. In 1927, a Los Angeles man named William Edward Hickman abducted a 12-year-old little girl named Marion Parker. His demand was for $1,500. When her father showed up with the cash, Hickman nodded to the girl sitting next to him in the car, wrapped in a blanket, and then he pushed her out and drove away. The father ran to grab his precious baby girl and immediately began screaming. Poor Marion was already dead. She had been strangled with a piece of wire. Her cheeks were rouged, her eyes were sewn shut, her limbs had been removed, and her insides had been replaced with bloody towels, which I honestly don't even want to know what that was all about. But police were able to trace the towels back to the Bellevue Arms apartment and the 20-year-old Hickman. When police came to arrest him, his mother was in shock. "It can't be so," she said. "He's a good, clean boy." Hickman pled insanity. The jury disagreed, and Hickman was hanged. But it does seem as though most of the kidnappers during that time period really were just in it for the fast cash. So, of course, this made members of wealthy families the most tempting targets. 13-year-old Adolphus Bush Orthwein was the heir to the Anheuser-Busch fortune and was snatched out of a chauffeured limousine in St. Louis on New Year's Eve 1930. Fortunately for him, his ordeal was brief because the father of the guy who had done the kidnapping called Adolphus' father the very next day and was like, "Look, I'm sorry, my son is unemployed and desperate, but as one father to another father, I want to give you back your boy." And when Adolphus was returned unharmed, the grateful family was so generous, they offered to help the kidnapper find a job. But unfortunately for the kidnapper, Charles Abernathy, the cops weren't as forgiving. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Now, a lot of the professional criminals were abducting adults. On June 15th, 1933, William Ham Jr., the Ham Brewing Company's owner, was snatched on his walk home for lunch. His kidnappers demanded $100,000. A beer truck full of cash arrived at the agreed-upon secret rendezvous point, and Ham was released. 6 months later, Edward G. Brummer, heir to the Schmidt Brewery, was abducted in St. Paul. This time, the kidnappers demanded $200,000. Once they received it, they drove Brummer to Rochester, Minnesota, and left him. But unfortunately for these kidnappers, Brumer's father was a friend of President Franklin Roosevelt. So FDR pushed for the FBI to help with solving this case, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover got to work on it. His agents were able to trace the kidnappers' route and found a gas can that they had used to refuel. They were able to pull fingerprints from it and traced it back to the Barker gang. These guys had previously been bank robbers, but had apparently moved on to kidnapping. The determination had been made that these were the guys responsible for both kidnappings of Brumer and Ham. Agents surrounded the cottage where Doc, Ma, and Fred Barker engaged with them in a 6-hour gunfight. In the end, the Barkers were killed, and the FBI agents got a tip that another associate, Alvin Karpis, had been spotted in New Orleans. Alvin, who went by the nickname of Creepy, was thought to be the engineer behind both of the kidnappings. Director Hoover, who had not yet made an arrest, wanted to get in on the action and be there to personally arrest Creepy. So, Hoover, along with a team of 15 other agents, went to the hotel in New Orleans and arrested Creepy as he exited the hotel. At least, this is the official FBI story. Some people doubt portions of the retelling, saying that Hoover was working overtime to improve both his personal image and that of the Bureau, but I guess we'll never know for sure. You see, the kidnappings that involved mobsters or gangsters seemed to actually be entertaining to the public, as newspapers printed sensationalized stories with photos like the one of the slain mobster with his head resting in a bowl of spaghetti, his blood mingling with spilled wine. Yeah, they actually put that in the newspaper. When these types of stories involved those on the wrong side of the law, the newspapers often poked fun at the perpetrators and the victims alike. And people seemingly ate that stuff up. But on the night of March 1st, 1932, no one was laughing when 20-month-old Charles Augustus Lindenberg Jr. was stolen from his home in rural New Jersey. This is the case that had embarrassed Director Hoover and tarnished the reputation of the FBI as a whole, and is why many people believe that Hoover was pushing so hard to be the hero in the Barker gang case a year later. Because at that time, the Lindenburg case had not yet been solved. Now, this particular kidnapping was really big news because of who the child's father was. Charles Lindenberg was an American aviator and military officer who was famous for flying the first non-stop solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. He made the trip on May 20th, 1927. The 3,600-mile flight from New York to Paris lasted 33.5 hours and made him one of the most famous people in the world. This was an amazing feat at that time, and people idolized him for his great courage in flying alone across the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, the fact that he was such a good-looking guy helped with his popularity as well. Now, I don't think that Charles fully expected the level of global fame that his feat would bring. I mean, I'm sure he realized it was a big deal, but I don't think he was expecting the level of paparazzi and idol worship type of attention he would get. The constant attention was a lot, and Charles really did not like it and was known to actively seek privacy. Now, not long after he comes into all of this fame, Charles meets a young woman by the name of Anne Spencer Morrow. They quickly fell in love, got married, and started traveling the world together with the cameras trailing behind them. So when they had their first child, which was a son, they decided that they wanted to raise him away from the media fanfare in which they had been living, and they found a place in New Jersey where they felt they could be out of the spotlight. But unfortunately, as you probably know, they wouldn't be left alone to live in peace, and their lives were tragically torn apart when their son was kidnapped from his crib in the middle of the night. Now, this case is actually quite extensive. Just know that I'm really only hitting the main points for the sake of time. So, Charles Lindenberg Jr., the baby in this case, his bedroom was on the second story of the home. So the kidnapper had leaned a ladder against the house in order to climb it and gain access to the baby's room, but in their rush had left the ladder behind. In fact, there were only 3 pieces of evidence left behind in this case. The homemade ladder, which was broken, we'll get to that in a minute, footprints in the mud, and a handwritten ransom note that was demanding $50,000 in exchange for the child's safe return. The family first noticed that Junior was missing when the nanny went to check on him at 10 p.m. 30 minutes later, the Lindenburg home was swarmed with law enforcement officers and the media. And the massive amount of attention from the media is what alerted the kidnapper to just how important this family really was to the community. And so 3 days later, the family gets another ransom note, upping the amount to $70,000, which is about equivalent to $1 million in today's money. Now, this family was very famous. They were in the public eye a lot, and so it's easy to see why they were targeted. But police thought it was odd that the kidnappers seemed to know some intimate details about the family, like the fact that they knew which room belonged to the baby. So they felt like these little details like that meant that maybe it was someone who knew the family personally or had been watching them closely for some time. So the media dubs this story the crime of the century. The general public seems to be following this very closely, watching the newspapers. And then there's this retired school teacher by the name of Dr. John Condon, who came forward and claims to have heard directly from the kidnappers and volunteers to act as a go-between for the family and the kidnapper. Now, when I read this, I was like, huh? Who is this guy? I dug into this a bit because there's no detail as to like how this guy was connected to the family. Like, where did he come from? But from what I can tell, it appears as though he was just someone who was following this case in the media and had decided to insert himself into it. He had decided to write a letter to the kidnapper and have it published in the Bronx Home News. In this letter, he offers to act as a go-between for the Lindenburg family and the kidnapper. So the very next day after this letter is published, he gets a letter from someone claiming to be the kidnapper who agrees to letting him be the go-between. So that's when he called the Lindenburg family and told them that he had been in contact with the kidnapper and was willing to be a liaison between the kidnapper and the family. What was this guy doing inserting himself into a situation with total strangers? Like, was he trying to get fame? Of course, he could have very well have been just a very kind, sympathetic guy who was a dad and a grandfather, and he just had a bleeding heart, imagining the horror that this family was going through. But I don't know. I think modern day things have made me jaded when it comes to that. Let me know what you guys think. So the Lindenbergs agree to Dr. Condon being their go-between, and he gets to work. 1 month and 12 ransom notes later, Dr. Condon finally sets up a meeting with the kidnapper to get the child's location. At the meetup, the kidnapper calls himself John and doesn't really do anything to try to hide his appearance. Dr. Condon hands him over a bag with bills and gold notes and receives a letter in return. The letter he receives from the kidnapper says that Junior's being held on a boat named the Nellie. Condon gives this information to authorities and says that he can identify the kidnapper should he ever see him again. But there's no boat named Nellie in the location that the kidnapper had specified, and unfortunately, there was also no Junior. Then, tragically, 72 days after the kidnapping, Charles Jr. is found dead less than 5 miles from his home. Skull bruises indicate death by trauma to the head. As the family and the nation begins to mourn, the resolve to locate Charles Jr.'s murderer and bring him to justice is stronger than ever before. So because of the fact that both parents were fully awake and the home was full of staff when the kidnapping took place, as well as the other information I mentioned earlier about their knowledge of the home's layout, authorities immediately suspected that this was possibly an inside job. There was also the fact that the family had not lived in the home for very long, meaning that all of the staff were new and relatively unknown to the family, which meant that the house full of staff was really a house full of strangers. Now, because of the broken ladder and the injuries to the child's skull, the working theory was that maybe this was kind of a kidnapping gone wrong. This kidnapper may have fully intended on returning the child once they got money, but when the ladder broke, the child was accidentally dropped on his head and died. And then maybe the panicked kidnapper simply stashed the body while continuing to try and extort a payout. So from the very beginning, police were immediately suspicious of one of the maids by the name of Violet Sharp. Now, some reports I read said that she was Charles Sr. and Anne's housekeeper, while other reports say that she was actually their mother-in-law's maid, but either way, she worked for the family. After the initial kidnapping, Violet was questioned, and according to police, she was uncooperative and her alibi kept changing. So for about 2 months prior to them finding Charles' body, police just kept badgering this woman about the case. They were certain that she knew something. And then once the body was found, she was brought back in for questioning. Police still weren't buying the answers she was giving, and so they called her in for a second interview and arranged to have her bank history gone through. But the day before the hearing, she ended her own life by drinking poison, which is super sad, but also sounds suspicious until you read the FBI reports that say Violet's movements on the night of the kidnapping were carefully checked and she had been completely cleared as having had no connection to the kidnapping. Which also makes you wonder, was she suffering from some type of guilt over this whole thing, even if she had nothing to do with it? Did she somehow feel responsible? Or was she maybe worried that this whole thing would get pinned on her? So the police go on for another year without any further leads. They have Condon's description and a drawing of the suspect, but without any other clues that hadn't really been very helpful for them. With the discovery of the Lindenburg baby's body on May 12th, 1932, things changed literally overnight. President Franklin Roosevelt ignored the fact that U.S. government at that time had no jurisdiction over kidnappings, and he ordered federal law enforcement agencies to aid the state and local investigators until the criminals were brought to justice. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover then came forward announcing that this case would have the full backing of his agency and the Department of Justice and all of their resources to help find the killer. So experts across multiple industries start sharing their knowledge. Handwriting experts examine the multitude of ransom notes and determine that they believe the suspect could be of German heritage. Dr. Condon also met with dialect experts who had him try to mimic how John's accent sounded so they could try and narrow down potential matches. Glad that wasn't me. I wouldn't have been any help. They'd have been like, Australian? And no, I was trying to do a German accent. Woodworking experts even joined in and examined the ladder to narrow down the very specific type of wood that was used. But despite all that was being done, no suspects were found. Authorities were hoping that the greed that caused the crime in the first place would hopefully lead to the criminal making a mistake. So the FBI notified all the banks and shops in the area to closely track the serial numbers on the gold notes that had been involved in the ransom payment. So these gold notes were, of course, during the time period when our money was still actually backed by gold. And so someone could take the gold note to the bank and redeem it for cash. And so they were monitoring these serial numbers for months and months with no results. But then all of a sudden, the FBI starts getting calls from all kinds of places: gas stations, grocery stores, insurance agencies, and banks, all reporting transactions matching the listed serial numbers. So the FBI starts tracking the location on the map, indicating the movement of the money. And on September 18th, 1934, a banker calls about a $10 gold certificate that was included in a deposit that matches one of the serial numbers of the gold notes paid in the ransom. Authorities quickly ran to try and trace how these gold certificates got to the bank, and they're able to trace it back to a gas station. Now, the gas station attendant was able to give the agent a license plate number for the person who had used the certificate. He had noted down the license plate number because he thought the man actually kind of looked like the sketch he had seen of the potential kidnapper in the Lindenburg case. So the license plate is registered to a German carpenter by the name of Bruno Richard Hauptmann. When the authorities see Bruno, they think he looks almost identical to the sketch of the man that Dr. Condon had met and paid the ransom to. And when they started to look into Bruno, he had a record of theft in Germany. Following World War I, when the economy was bad and work was scarce, he had been arrested and convicted of 3 separate robbery charges. After being paroled, he had been arrested a 4th time for selling stolen goods, and that time he had ran and hopped on a ship to the United States. Another damning piece of evidence against him was that all of his recent transactions were mostly $10 and $20 gold certificates. A large amount of these gold certificates were discovered in his home, and he even still had some in his pockets when he was detained. Writing samples from him also matched the broken English and misspelled words that were found in the ransom notes, and there was the matter of the homemade ladder that we talked about earlier. The wood expert had originally traced the wood back to the exact lumber yard it was purchased from, and once they had pegged down Bruno as being their man, investigators went to his home, and the wood expert was able to match the wood used to make the homemade ladder to Bruno's home. They claimed that he had built the ladder from pieces he had cut out of the rafters of his home. In 1935, Bruno was convicted and sentenced to be executed, which was carried out the following year. Again, they did not play back in the day. Now, like I mentioned earlier, as long as the telling of the story was, that was the nutshell version. Well, the nutshell version of the official story. Many people don't believe this popular narrative of how things went down. There are a lot of things that seem fishy about this case, and many believe that Lindenberg himself may have had something to do with his son's death. Apparently, Charles Lindenberg had some pretty bizarre behavior following his son's death, which may or may not always be indicative of guilt, since people do respond to stressful situations and grief very differently. But people found it odd that the police never seemed to look at any of the family as potential suspects, and many have pointed out how odd it was that at times it seemed as though Charles himself was the one that was leading the investigation into his son's death. Charles was also believed to have lied about what time he came home on the night of the kidnapping, and he wasn't forthcoming about some of the health issues that his son had. Now, if you're like me, you're kind of wondering, like, what in the world would have been Charles' motive to have anything to do with his son's death? And this is where his son's health issues kind of come into play. Apparently, there was a doctor who was working on a new procedure for a heart bypass, and Charles's sister had a bad heart. And so one of the theories had to do with Charles's views on eugenics in relation to people who were sick, and his connections with this particular doctor that I just mentioned, and how some of the experiments that doctor was doing could have possibly helped Charles' sister, but those experiments would have required organs that could have possibly come from Charles's son, because apparently when Charles Jr. was found, he was missing organs. Now, to me, this whole situation is so horrible. I can't imagine losing my child and then being blamed for their murder. So it's hard for me to imagine smearing someone's name who's lost their child if there was no truth to the theory. Since I didn't have the time to fully dig into this and develop my own opinion on all of these theories, but I did go far enough down the rabbit hole to realize that there are a growing number of people who believe that Charles Sr. had something to do with his son's death. So I thought it was worth mentioning in case you guys wanted to do some more research for yourself. There's some intriguing stuff out there to look into. So, of course, as always, I'm linking all of my sources down below if you guys want to do your own digging. Now, also note, this is another instance where we look back with our modern lens and we automatically look at the people that are closest to the victim because, you know, that's what we see a lot. But it wouldn't have been nearly as common back then for people to be side-eyeing the family, at least not to the extent that we do today, as they would automatically have seen them as victims as well. And especially not someone who was such a beloved character, someone who was seen as an American hero in the way that Charles Lindenberg was at the time. But even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt seems to have had some doubts surrounding who was responsible for Charles Jr.'s murder. After the conviction of Hoffman, she said, "It seemed the verdict had been based entirely on circumstantial evidence. While not in sympathy with Hoffman, I was a little perturbed at the thought of what might happen to any innocent person in a similar situation. The entire trial left me with a question in my mind, and I was certainly glad that I did not have to sit on that jury." And now, more than 90 years later, there are still many questions left unanswered surrounding the abduction and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. Now, as heartbreaking as the case of baby Charlie is, its relevance to the whole kidnapping epidemic issue that the country was experiencing at that time was largely due to the way that the case helped to push through stricter federal laws. This case pushed the nation to collectively grieve over the baby of a national hero, and it also created an urgency for change and harsher punishments for those committing these types of crimes. So following this terrible case, a new law was passed in the U.S. called the Federal Kidnapping Act, or as it was nicknamed, the Lindenburg Law. At the time, no federal kidnapping law exists, limiting federal authorities' ability to investigate the offenses once it crossed state lines. So the Federal Kidnapping Act made kidnapping across state lines a federal crime and gave federal authorities the power to pursue kidnappers who crossed state lines. And it also stipulated that kidnapping could be punishable by death. Now, while this law got its nickname from the most famous kidnapping case, the Federal Kidnapping Act of 1932 was in reaction to a string of kidnappings that had began before the Lindenburg baby was even born. In fact, it had been introduced 3 months prior to baby Charlie even being kidnapped. Once again, to hammer home just how big of a problem these kidnappings were, the day after the Lindenburg kidnapping, a New York Times article offered a partial list of the most recent kidnappings in various states. In Illinois, there were 49, Michigan had 26, California had 25, Indiana 20, and so on and so on. The paper reported that more than 2,000 people had been abducted in the country in the previous 2 years. Of course, there were likely many more kidnappings that went unreported, as some of the victims were the criminals themselves who were grabbed by rival gangsters and then sold back to their own gangs if they were lucky. Now, if they weren't so lucky and negotiations fell through, then they'd be looking at a situation like Chicago detective testified about before the House Judiciary Committee in February 1932. He let the lawmakers imagine what could happen when he told them about a raid that he did on a kidnapping ring's lair that he said included a torture chamber, which appeared to have been used quite frequently and hinted at the most unbelievable of horrors. Items found in the lair included vats of lime, cans of gasoline, and diving suits. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering, what's up with the diving suits? Well, apparently this was a sort of torture technique that these kidnappers would use, where they would put their captives in these diving suits, they would lower them down to the bottom of the Chicago River, and only let them up every now and again for air. Like, just before they were going to drown, they'd pull them back up again. The Times reported on this story and said that upon being brought up from the cold and total darkness, these victims would likely be willing to do whatever their captors wanted, whether it was to just stay out of their gang's territory, or if he was to beg his employers to pay a big ransom, or maybe even both. And of course, there was also speculations that some of these victims may have never been pulled back up. At the dawn of the 1930s, taking a kidnapping victim across a state line was a smart tactic. In this pre-digital era, there wasn't much coordination or cooperation among the police and courts of the states. Most states did not have a statewide police force, and also they weren't able to subpoena potential witnesses across state lines. So somebody could witness a kidnapping, but if the kidnapper took that person over to another state and then they were called over there, they couldn't call this person to testify here. So that caused some issues, but also laws against kidnapping varied from state to state. And so extradition was extremely cumbersome. Obviously, communication was difficult through various means, especially when you consider that fewer than half of American households at that time had telephones. So even just being able to call people to communicate with them, all of that we take for granted nowadays, they didn't have back then. So a lot of things took a lot longer. And because the laws were different, communication was slow or non-existent, their hands were tied in a lot of ways. This all just made things a lot more difficult. And sadly, you also had the fact that some local cops augmented their modest incomes by taking monies in return for not chasing criminals too aggressively. Indirectly, the upticks in these kidnappings had helped to expose the corruption within these cities and small community police forces. And this was more evidenced by the fact that some victims were rescued by gangsters when the small town police just kind of watched from the sidelines. As stricter laws became put in place, judges became more likely to impose capital punishment. Now, defendants' rights back in the 1930s were virtually non-existent. Defendants didn't have very many grounds for appeal, and so it's not like nowadays where you see these people that may get the death penalty, but they're held up in appeals and all the process and back and forth for years and years and years. None of that was going on. And so when this capital punishment came down, judgment was swift. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, there were 167 executions a year on average in the 1930s, which is more than any other decade in American history. But by golly, if it didn't work as a deterrent. And vigilante justice was a pretty good deterrent as well, as public disgust caused them to finally stop idolizing mobsters and begin seeing them as the criminals that they were. There was a case out of California where these two lowlifes kidnapped the 22-year-old heir of a department store fortune. But they didn't want the hassle of having to drag him around while they waited for the ransom money they had demanded. So they hit Brooke Hart over the head with bricks, then tied more bricks to his body with wire and threw him over a bridge. When he came back up, he was screaming for help, and so they shot him. The kidnappers placed their initial call demanding $400,000 from the family. And the second time the killers called back, police traced the call and arrested the two men. Once in custody, 3 different counties argued over jurisdiction until finally an impatient mob broke into the jail, dragged the men out, drug them to a nearby park, and hanged them, while thousands of people cheered. The next day, the California governor at the time, James Roth, called it a fine lesson to the whole nation. No one ever went to jail for the kidnappers' murders because while kidnapping was a crime in California, lynching wasn't. With the passing of the Federal Kidnapping Act that I mentioned earlier, the wave of abductions was ending. New law enforcement techniques like criminal profiling were developed, which of course assisted in streamlining and speeding up investigations. Some people who survived kidnappings were able to treat their time in captivity as excellent adventures once they had bathed and changed their clothes. But for most of them, they were emotionally scarred for life, even if they didn't realize it until much later. Apart from the infamous abduction of Charles Lindenberg Jr., most of these kidnappings have faded from memory. But they defined the times as much as bank robberies, speakeasies, and panhandling. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Let me know if you learned something new. And until next time, check out some of my other episodes.